So, Logothetis is, shall I start over? Or could you hear a little bit of what I said? It was good, okay. So Logothetis, there are very few papers on him it's surprising because Logothetis could be considered really the grandfather of the tenor community in many ways. So it was surprising to see how much he has already anticipated of what we're dealing with right now. And so I want to take his work and his ideas as a jumping stone for some, for the presentation of some work that we did in Hamburg, and also maybe to raise a few questions generally about reading. That's also your topic, reading scores. What does it actually mean? And what types of readings do we have? And, it's just very good to see that various people are working on this, on these questions. So my presentation will I'm going to have a small introduction. I want to introduce the notion of the morphome. I want to talk about human score reading, and then as an expansion of that, the machine and hybrid score reading, which also involves we're talking about the exact same question. We found a label for it, but I'm not sure whether it's going to stay. But we're dealing with this idea of the unified musical instrument surfaces, which fulfill several functions at the same time. So I'm going to quickly talk about some solutions that we came up with in Hamburg. Then we're going to talk about augmented and virtual reality and the outlook on AI. I think I'm going to skip because of course, time reasons, or time concerns. So here's a book, and one of the reasons why Logothetis' work has not been received much outside of Greece and Germany is the fact that little of it was translated into English. And most of it he has written in German. He has been going to a German high school in Greece, and then later migrated to Vienna shortly after World War II. So he's really a member of the Greek diaspora in a German-speaking country, and so. Contemporary music composer until he realized that he was looking for something else in the notation of music, and he developed a system which actually was supposed to capture unlike his contemporary and his the other Viennese great graphical composer, Roman Haubenstock-Ramati, he was not particularly interested in presenting beautiful images and having musicians take inspiration from that. Rather, he was interested in creating a flexible notations for conductors and musicians, which also allowed for precise pitch notation. So he came up with three categories of signs: pitch symbols, association factors, and action signals. Unfortunately, we don't have really much time to go over that. I recommend you pick up one of his books, and I'm not sure, maybe whether some of this has been published in English. I suppose there is some translations, but of course, my references are all to the German literature. So this book contains essays by him and some also essays by other composers. So here, polymorphism. What fundamentally differentiates graphic notation from traditional notation is the aforementioned polymorphism, which clearly enables all performers to retain their subjective reaction times. The composer takes into consideration the diverse through the new formalization of musical form in every performance. So polymorphism is something that he was like, I would say, almost fanatical after, and you could see that he also applied this concept of polymorphism in his text pieces. Here's an example for polymorphism in text composition, where different readings of this text is possible. So he uses the Greek word anthropos, which can also be interpreted in German as a, do, and po. And without going into the deeper meaning of this, it is kind of almost symbolic for logotheticist approach to perform different types of readings. He applies different templates, different modes of reference to generate meaning from phonemes. So that's something that was positions, and it's something that he has practiced until his death in 1994. Now I quickly want to talk about the morphome, because Zeichen als Aggregatzustand der Musik, signs as aggregate state of music, is a clear reference to the sciences. So you see in Logothetis, like in his contemporary Xenakis, a certain reference to the natural sciences as a foundation of the theory, and as also maybe as a sort of a justification. But instead of turning to physics, he could have also turned to genetics, because in genetics you find a very elaborate system which allows polymorphism. For instance, we have a gene complex called the major histocompatibility complex, for which 32,000 different spellings, so to speak, are known. And a similar phenomena we encounter in a phenomenon called gene overlap, where you have autophase readings and sense antisense reading, where you have like two strands of the DNA, and usually only one strand codes for DNA, but occasionally, because of mutations, suddenly the similar things in logotheticist work. Here, for instance, is an image of his piece Dynapolis, which actually takes street maps into consideration. So you have paths that go in certain ways, and as you see, the time of the composition. Therefore, I would like to give a definition of the morphome, which is the totality of all possible readings of a score. I also want to mention quickly that Lindsay Vickery, without making explicit, taking an explicit reference to logotheticist work, also has talked about scores as being maps, street maps, and maps for other things, for basically could be a city layout or something similar. So this relates to his notion of rhizomatic score. And also see this in a lot of other works here, also presented at tenor, that people are thinking about maps and paths and alternative paths and ways to navigate musical structures. And I was delighted to see Michael's presentation. Includes alternative paths through a sequenced, sequence basically. So human score reading, of course, involves hierarchies of reading. Baveli and Georgaki, whom you mentioned today, the music of Logothetis. It's in my references section. I would recommend you check it out. And they look at how aspects of local versus global reading, things that are pertain to the precise resolution like pitch, and other things which are more pertain to things that should inspire musicians in a to react in a intuitive way to a music score. Also would like to use in this context the term analytical versus synthetic, because the term analytical hearing has been applied to musicians who are capable of hearing partials very precisely, whereas the term synthetic hearing has been applied to musicians and listeners that are more listening to fundamentals and have a greater sense for the perception of timbre. So as there's sense. And of course, in this local versus global, analytical versus synthetic paradigm, we also find intermediate levels where you have more fine-grained resolution or a more coarse, more global resolution. And just to give you can apply to a score until you give up the analytical and local interpretation, and you switch to a different mode, which I call synthetic and global. So this is an interesting topic would be an interesting topic to find out which when actually these kinds of switches take place. Someone who, music psychologist who would like to undertake this, let me know about that. But a quick run through machine and hybrid score reading. We have an example of Yannick Xenakis' EPIC system, and then about 25 years later we have Yannick's, the software implemented on commercial computers. And here's an example for machine and hybrid score reading, a beautiful piece by Simon Catan, or Catan, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, which on Vimeo. It's a beautiful piece, and it also not just visually pleasing. Here's something that you might find interesting. That's the Hexenkästchen by Jakob Zello. Here you have an instrument, an acoustic instrument that triples as a controller, as an acoustic. It has a display, a projector built into it, and it tracks gestures and it feeds the computer with this information so that scores can be displayed on the fly, can be changed in response to the actions of the musician. So there's also a larger version of this for timpani. This was a tom-tom. So I was also interested in creating software that would be the intermediate level for this. So here's an example for something that I projected onto the surface of this instrument, and we're currently about developing ways to connect this display to turning these scores into some reactive scores by means of expressions. One of the co-authors, James Chung, is also sitting in the audience, and he's been helping me with figuring out this concept. And here's another application of that, augmented and virtual reality. You can, of course, apply the same concept in I don't want to who creates you know, representations of 20th century artwork. She turns them into VR you know, spaces that you can walk into, and you can actually then grab and manipulate elements from the paintings and turn them into music. Kandinsky, who has a whole theory about this, is of course an ideal person. So I will now show you just 30 seconds of her last project, which is being shown at the Hamburg Kunsthalle, and it's called Der weiße Punkt, the white dot. And yeah, you can see for yourself. There's probably also some sound, right? Yeah. Something audible? Wait. Yeah.
Do you mind if I do this, or your sound preference? Which?
I see. Yeah, my sound preferences. No, I haven't switched to the to this here yet. Wait, sound preferences. So very quick. 30 seconds.
So actually, with the
So the polymorphism is given by the path that the user takes through this painting. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Well, my question about that last so as I understood it, the division of artwork and the issue if there is some theory behind that. How does it fit together? Why this choice of this?
Yeah, there's a whole theory behind that, and I think I put you in touch with Christina, so you can figure it out. You know, you guys can mail each other, and then she'll tell you her theory and what she found in Kandinsky's writings. Right? Yeah.
Very short. What's your particular stage online?
What do you want me to put online? Sorry. The slides. Yeah, I will. Yes, definitely. Okay. Also, let's stay in touch. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Bye bye.
Was presenting a paper that was co-authored. This paper is another co-authored one presented by Kieran Frank on my University of Spencer, and co-authored. A conductor and change ensemble.
Right. Yes. I think it's all good. Thank you. Great. My phone informs me that I have to leave at 4:14, so I can do it. I'm going to keep it snappy. It's the end anyway, right? So. I'm looking at presenting this piece that I've written for conductor and chamber ensemble, and it's stemming from our team's work. So it's myself, Alana Ilsar, and Sam Trolland at Sensor Lab at Monash University in Melbourne. And we work on a sort of project with a new digital musical instrument called the Airstick, which is very funny. It's a little spooky that we've been talking so much about compositional roles and knives and things this afternoon. But before I get into that, as someone working in music technology, I've always been fascinated by the roles that we kind of embody in, especially in the Western classical kind of tradition. And obviously we've had lots of conversations about this, this conference. I guess our musical experiences in a Eurological centered kind of way have been built around these traditional roles like audience, performer, composer, conductor. Obviously, this is an oversimplification, but I think it classical tradition. I'm not necessarily happy with these roles, as I think the general consensus in this room perhaps indicates. But I guess one of these roles is the conductor, who are often viewed as the mediators between, this idea of the musical work and the performer, sort of acting as this intermediary. Interesting because, obviously a lot of chamber ensembles have kind of opted out of using a conductor more recently, especially in things like quartets, which I found quite interesting because Aaron White and Kat Hope's paper, looking at Kat's opera Speechless, actually found that through a survey of these musicians, that the conductor is often desired in these animated notation contexts within this chamber ensemble, because it offers, greater accuracy or maybe more insight beyond the score itself. That's interesting because gesture obviously plays a big role and has played a big role in music and in notation. Here we have obviously an example of sound painting. We have Gil Dory's Arcos piece. We have Hoadley's opera Quantum Canticorum. These are all pieces that use notation and gesture kind of particularly in context of music notation, which struck me as a little bit strange because we have all these works, but the actual role itself associated with the physical gesture is kind of missing. Alongside all of this, as it so happens, in our lab, we do a lot of research into gestural instruments. These are the Airsticks 2.0. It also comes in this and an accelerometer, basically. Communicates via Bluetooth to a custom application on Mac. And traditionally, we've used this as a DMI, so it generates sound through synthesis very broadly. But with this in mind, and with what I've previously talked about, we kind of had a piece that basically wrote itself. So Mutable Gestures is an improvisation system where musical material is provided to a chamber ensemble in the form of real-time traditional notation based on a conductor's movements. So it uses the Airstick and it simply communicates gestural data that is captured live from a conductor who is conducting a score. And these gestures are translated through Max to notation for each individual performer. And individual performers just jump onto a web browser because it's using DrawSocket and Max Score. So they have their own web page, it's a local area network, and they jump on, they receive their individual parts. And what that means is that a conductor can actually conduct towards a performer and notation will appear on their phones. I think it's really important to also acknowledge that there's a lot of intermediate software being used in this process, but two libraries in particular, DrawSocket and Max Score, A big shout out to Georg and Rama for all their specific help. I know Jonathan and I were sort of on Zoom up late in different time zones, and we actually managed to sort of transmit this notation onto a web server sort of while I was still in Melbourne. And the way that this data is mapped, it made it extremely easy to send these just simple messages and events to MaxScore and then to DrawSocket. It was almost plug and play, really. So speaking of mapping, there's no gestural kind of categorization or learning involved in from the translation of gesture to this traditional notation. This is an example. I won't go too much into the details. It's all in the paper, but it's basically a mixture of kind of arbitrary variables, so just simple mapping. You know, there's no reason why a roll on an air stick should necessarily mean a you know, musical technique. But on a broad level, I guess we're trying to sonify this data that's coming out of the air stick, so that maybe it might produce a similar result with a similar kind of conducting pattern. And I guess the idea is that it would, you know, create interesting, maybe linked material. There is some, you know, more sonified data. So, for example, very large kind of gestures will produce forte dynamics and things like that. And of course, it takes great event. We just have this stream of notes, which is kind of interesting in itself. But, you know, we need this kind of broader information if we want to use things like dynamics. So the max patch kind of keeps this buffer of information. For example, how much has the stick moved in the last 30 seconds? And then it uses that to inform the notation. Here's a quick example. With those buffers in mind, you can see that, you know, it's possible to conduct and for nothing to happen. I think that's probably a, you know, maybe an area of improvement. We did actually refine it since I filmed this, and it now generates notation a bit quicker because we found it was more satisfying. You know, your eye gets drawn to things appearing on the score. So we've actually increased the pace of this notation being generated. Let's skip ahead. So I guess more broadly, looking at what this changes, I think it's important to consider that original context of the roles that I was talking about, and yeah, what's this doing for chamber music and chamber ensembles? From an audience's perspective, it almost could be a traditional performance. If you didn't know that the conductor was holding an air stick, it could very well just be a conductor conducting music and the performer's interpreting a score, and it could just look like any other normal performance. Which I think is interesting because in reality, underneath the hood, we have these layers of interpretation. And so we're kind of obscuring this means of its endpoint, which is sound. And I think it's really funny that we were talking about, you know, instruments and knives before, because in a way, this piece and we're also using a DMI, so it's like we're using an instrument as a score. So I think there's these really complex layers that I think are really important because, yeah, we're really kind of looking at to come all the way full circle back to these roles. I'm interested in how we subvert these roles. So a conductor gesturing with the air stick is becoming a performer. They're almost playing in this notation. The composer will, I mean, I guess I am the composer, but, you know, I could see myself being a curator, maybe akin to sort of a film director as well. It's very hard to kind of say what I do, but I think I would say, you know, maybe I set the rules of engagement around this system to facilitate this kind of creation of music. And then, of course, the performer, they're improvising as well. So really they're kind of adding this role of composer and, you know, creating even more kind of musical materials. So I think this distribution of creative roles and almost, I mean, I like to call it democratization of the chamber ensemble is something that we think is really important.
Any questions for Kieran? Yes.
It's Claire, wonderful talk. I was wondering, in your last slide, where would you put the machine?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yourself in your work, and maybe some of the questions, I guess the answer can be very fluid, they can change all time, but I was wondering how much agency as a musician you want to give or provide to the machine, and if you consider it as an independent agent.
A kind of independent agent. I think this probably more can explain this evaluation of gesture, even though it is, you know, quite a simple mapping. I think it still is another layer of interpretation. I would hesitate to say it's maybe a compositional role, but then I would also hesitate to say that my role is compositional. So I think yeah, I guess I probably just don't have the vocabulary to sort of describe what it might be, but I think it's closest to a composer, but maybe it's a sort of facilitator or a...
What are the questions? It takes about 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
I was just wondering if you considered a few years ago there was this thing called a Wii remote,
Yeah.
which generated quite a bit of excitement. Because you pitch and yaw and
Yeah, no, it's essentially almost exactly the same thing. I guess the only benefit of the air stick is that we don't require any other external kind of...
But it'd be interesting to see, because there are quite a number of people did quite a lot of stuff using it. And stuff called osculator, it was called, I think, a little thing that to do it into Mac. So much.
Well, 30 seconds.
Thank you, and blah 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 compliments and
20 seconds. No, I'm joking.
One of the questions I had in reaction is, at least in your demonstration from the days previous, everything had kind of a real time, like just in time kind of reaction between the performers and you. And, you know, in fact, this isn't all even necessarily the case in an actual conductor. Sometimes they give a downbeat and then boom, the chord happens. And I think that this could also generate a very, very kind of relationship to the sheet music where they're really waiting, and then another can be that they have like the buffer of 10 seconds. Perhaps. Just my reactions.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, as you mentioned that, I think even there's something to be said for what even happens before the conductor has, you know, maybe made this gesture. Maybe there's already notation based on, you know, even the downbeat before a downbeat is here. But, you know, there's also all this extra information before a downbeat. So, yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Alex, present. And Jean, who's presenting on behalf of himself, and Jean Geoffroy.
Jean Geoffroy, it's not here.
On location spaces and directed music.
Okay. It's okay.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
So
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I am Vincent Carinola. I am composer. I am a teacher in Dijon, École Supérieure de Musique, Bourgogne-Franche-Comté. And I apologize for having to read my presentation. I don't speak very well English. Sorry. I'm going to talk about the question of the space of notation in musical works based on digital and interactive technologies. I will take as example two of my pieces, Touché for Theremin, computer, and another of works. It can be said that composing consists in a large part of building the instrument. This means that the instrument is a support for the notation and determines it. Of course, what we call an instrument has changed in nature with the contribution of electronic and digital technologies. To describe this change, I believe that the French term dispositif is well suited because it has a plurality of meanings in English: device, apparatus, machine, plan. And this forms an interesting lexical field, and above all, the relation between the verbs to dispose and to compose suggests the connection between musical instrument and musical writing. For the composer and the performer, understanding the mechanism by which the different components of the dispositif are arranged is essential to situate the places and the different functions of the notation. Let's see this in the example of Touché. Sorry. I can't not stop make, okay. Come here. Up. The sound being diffused on 6 independent channels. The audio output of the theremin is connected to the computer, which transforms the signal speech and intensity into control data for the sound processing modules used. The theremin is thus a part of the dispositif. The electronic sound of the theremin is almost never audible. Its function is to be a gestural interface, a transduction of the musician section, the imprint. I invite you to listen to some excerpts. it was Claudio PINA. Termine. Okay, an important part of the process of writing consists in structuring the performer's playing space around the theremin's antenna by cutting it into different concentric zones. When the hand evolves in one of the other zone, crossing them from one to the other, approaching or moving away from the antenna, modifies its speed, combines with the other hand, etc. Each of these movements produce a specific sound result and contribute to the definition of a gestural syntax and its sonorous equivalent, which will condition the structuring of the musical discourse. Let us note that it is the characteristic of any instrument to offer a structured space. In other words, an interface imprinting its logic on the gesture of the instrumentalist. Even in the absence of a physical object, the existence of this space, described in software form, is essential to give meaning to the musician's playing. In the case of touché, the structuring of the space around the antenna is closely correlated to the functioning of the different audio processing modules contained in the patch made with Max. The connection between the interface, this structured space, and the parameters to control sound processing was another important step of the process of writing. It was then a question of defining the mapping. This term, mapping, refers to the function of cartography or navigation map and to the meaning of the notation. The mapping will give each of the musician's gestures its audible equivalent. In touché, the mapping evolves throughout the piece and thus participates in its formal conception. It is a privileged space of the writing in which meet the structuration of the musician's playing space, the software description of the processing modules, and the algorithms determining the forms of interaction between them. The notation used in the graphic score shows in part this double aspect. The two upper staves indicate the global movement that the hand must make between the different zones, represented by the lines of the staff. The lower staff represents the sounds produced. However, this score is only a part of the totality of the score that the musician will have to interpret. A part of this escapes the graphic notation and is contained in the software. It is important to emphasize a characteristic of digital dispositifs, their ability to function automatically, following the instructions contained in the software. This means that the performer plays an instrument that, at least in part, functions independently of his or her action. This has two important consequences. The first is that, unlike the traditional instrument, the musical sound is not always the product of the performer's gesture or intentionality. He, the performer, extracts from the depths of the algorithm a sound material already there in virtual form, which he escorts while keeping a listening presence at each moment of his performance in a hand and ear correlation of great requirement. The second is that the musician must then know this notation space encoded in the computer program, where the logical characteristics of the instrument's operation are contained. For example, the automated synthesis evolutions or the parameters of which the performer acts. Musical sound is therefore the simultaneous product of the musician's action and the software computation. The possibility of an interaction between the performer and a notational space was the object of a singular reflection in virtual realism because of the original nature of the dispositif. Whereas in Touché, the dispositif is external to the performer, in virtual realism, it is almost incorporated because it is reduced to a smartphone. This contains both the gesture sensors and the computer. The miniaturization of the dispositif poses an interesting problem for the composer and for the interpreter, because there is no more physical space to be structured, and consequently there is no place for the elaboration of a mapping where a notation can be relevant. The danger is then that the interface becomes a sort of primitive rattle, like a maracas, capable of producing such an infinity of sounds that the audience is left with a feeling of arbitrariness and formlessness. The solution adopted was to introduce a technique that takes its source in orality. The formal structure of virtual realism can be compared to a memory palace. The performer goes through this memory palace according to a certain number of constraints, like a video game. The piece is structured in 23 situations that correspond to as many states of configuration of system. These are all musical sequences that can be combined each with other. Each situation is described in terms of type of motion capture, audio processing modules, samples used, and control parameters. We can okay, have an slide. It was Jean Geoffroy. Okay. The score contains two types of information: a textual description with diagrams of the dispositif functioning, and the graphical statement of a possible conduct or form. In this example, the performer alternates between situations backward, then forward again, obtaining each time new sounds, combinations, and always renewing the musical discourse. To the division of the work into 23 situations comes to be added a second division expressing by evocative indications of play, thus inviting the interpreter to work out his own script. Threatening, ghostly, ineluctable, etc. It should be noted that the graphic score is proposed as a model of form among others, resulting from the proposal of Jean Geoffroy. The graphical score is only the trace of a possible path among an infinity. In conclusion, there is a plurality of a space even the samples chosen contain both information on the form and material of the work, and at the same time on the functioning of the instrument tone dispositive. In order to escape the algorithmic logic of if, then, else of interactive dispositive, which could transform the performer into a sample operator, Touché and Virtual Rhizome introduce an element of indeterminacy into the program. They provide two examples of the proximity between this new notational space and the open works. But in Touché, the notation still reflected the temporal form of the work's performance. In Virtual Rhizome, it only exemplifies a possible path among an infinity. In fact, the notational space exists in this case above all virtually, in the form of a memory palace, a kind of labyrinth that the performer roams at will and embodies. Thank you for your attention.
Any questions?
Thanks for the talk. I was impressed by your use of the term dispositive, because I think that it covers a lot of presentation. The use of this notion beyond the social or even political aspects of the musical instrument technologies, code, smartphones.
Yeah, you know, I don't say that, but this word, dispositive, is also very interesting in French because it's a word from Foucault, from philosophy from Foucault, and it has political meaning also. Very important, yes. I can't develop it here.
Using it to conceptualize outwards. So this is I think was interesting. Perhaps we can
Foucault and also Giorgio Agamben.
For a coffee, so we're going to adjourn for a coffee, is that right?
That's correct.
And then we'll come back at 5 o'clock.
I thought perhaps it would be a good idea to shorten the coffee break, but it's up. Like 15, 20 minutes. Break.
So meet back here for us to start the performance at 10 to. Good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
beautiful schools.
It was understanding.
Yeah, no, the school was beautiful. Your school was beautiful.
Ah.
Description of the yeah, right there. Very good. Your therapist is very good. The therapist,
Yes.
he's really good.
Joch has left this back.
Okay. Good luck, James. Just beautiful, just.
Wow. Are you doing it?
Yes. Tomorrow.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is Stansted used to be your local.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yes, very, very beautiful. Best of them. Still up. Are you done? Merde. Ah non, mais c'est pas le micro, c'est l'enceinte. Attends, non, je sais pas. Attends, on va la remettre en place.
Parce qu'ils ont mis en route, je sais pas quoi, des micros HF. Sans fil.
C'est parti. Un boucle de masse bizarre.
Ouais. Il faut compter.
I am speaking. C'est juste la toute première fois. Là, c'est une image.
C'est bon?
Ouais.
Et bon, j'avais dit que je commençais moins fort, donc je reviens à moins 10. Je vais partir un peu plus loin. Ah oui, comme ça, il fait un peu moins 10. Exactement. Je demande à la copie et voilà.
I am speaking. I.
Oui, c'est ça. Mais qu'est-ce que ça en Mars, je sais pas quoi, là, non, le score de Max. Et effectivement, les données sont certaines informations, mais c'est pas le cas. Moi, je suis d'accord. Ah oui. D'accord. C'est finalement très compliqué techniquement, mais pour un résultat, c'est extrêmement intéressant de visualiser. Non, mais attends, justement, on est là dans des tasses un peu la moi, je suis surpris par sa orientation. Aujourd'hui, ça l'est beaucoup. Mais le reste, pas forcément. De toute façon, cette année, on va faire des lettres. C'est une chose essentielle. Là, on le sait. Pour l'année prochaine, j'en parlais avec vous. Par contre, la problématique, elle est intéressante. Il y a ces pièces que j'ai fait c'est intéressant parce que c'est souvent c'est pas le problème. C'est le problème de rapport entre la lettre et un mec qui fait la musique de chambre à jouer de ce rapport entre la réalité virtuelle et réelle qui jouent vraiment ensemble. Justement, bien montrer que le problème, c'est pas c'est comment on se rend compte sur le plateau alors qu'on est censé être dans deux mondes différents. Ça fait un petit peu. Et puis ouais, surpris. Il y a un lien comme ça. Et bon, à l'automne, je pourrais penser à l'avance. Moi, ce que j'avais fait, déjà que ce soit agréable, parce que ça va être. Non, je ne suis pas agréable. Moi, j'ai une soirée vachement là. Parce que moi, le truc de ténor, ça fait. J'avais noté dans mes calendriers. C'est Jonathan m'avait prévenu il y a l'année dernière. Il m'a dit d'ailleurs, il y avait un téléphone. Moi, j'ai foutu mon agenda attention. J'ai noté. Là, je pense que c'est énormément, sinon tu peux pas vraiment. Moi, j'ai tout dit. Mais je pense qu'elle est. Il y a pas mal de trucs pour le voir. Moi, je trouvais que ça prend compte de quoi c'était des gens c'était une référence puis après, puis non, attends, moi j'ai non, sur un papier immédiat, je mets mon CV, et tu mets mon mail immédiat, tu mets pas le nom perso. Et j'ai des conneries comme ça, encore mais sinon, non, c'est pas le seul truc qu'il y a, c'est que je ne sais pas si ça va passer. C'est un papier de loi. Non, mais c'est. Non, mais déjà, si ça va. Non, mais s'il ne va passer, c'est super. Je pense que s'il ne fait passer, c'est parce qu'il y a des mots plus politiques. Ouais. Après, de toute façon, c'est des mots. La pièce passe, c'est bien. Je pense qu'il va passer parce que. Je me dis, c'est super. Mais en fait, il a créé mon PowerPoint parce que je n'ai pas compris. Oui, vraiment, un PowerPoint. J'ai fait pour la présentation de projet qui connaissait un petit peu bien. Et bon, ça envoie le PowerPoint, on voit le message. Et puis, du coup, j'ai vu des photos et un peu de ce que j'ai fait qui reconnaît en fait le rapport de PowerPoint. Ça l'a fait comme il y avait ah non, moi je trouve que le Moi, je pense pas grand-chose, mais non, non, c'est cohérent. Moi, je pense qu'il je sais pas, moi, je pense que mais en fait, je pense que j'avais reçu une année, mais j'ai peut-être passé, voilà, il a tout à fait, moi, j'ai dit, je suis les gens, je vais voir, je prends des coups. Oui. C'est pas sûr comme outil, je pense. La sphère. Ah oui, j'entends. Oui, et moi, j'aimerais bien arriver à avoir un peu de lien entre les deux. C'est pas évident, c'est ce que je trouve. Mais c'est un peu le projet. Pour le même, c'était dans ce comme. C'est une bonne reconnaissance. Cool. Non, non. Les gens qui
I advise you to sit a little more in the middle, but COVID is not over, but it's a little bit over. And it's really better if you're a little more in the middle. I've said that in sure most of you have heard of divorce paths. I'm speaking into a microphone.
I'm speaking into a microphone. and I am disassembling the sound of my speaking voice into its constituent parts, the elemental periods. I am going to play back these periods in a different, much slower tempo, and with spatial trajectories depending on their sound character, such that we no longer produce a continuous pitch, but a rhythm that unfolds over time and space. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of physical fact, but as a way to reflect on time and the multi-scale nature of musical structures.
if there are any questions on the piece.
And I
The trajectories were all starting here, coming from my map, and depending on the brilliance of the vowels, things would go more on the left, after the right, and depending on the periodicity, things would go faster or slower. So the non-periodic things, fricatives and so on, they would go very fast. The vowels would go a bit slower, more definite. That's the composition part of it. These mappings make it. So,
I mean, the first few words are to say initially or
yeah, every single bit of my that 1 minute text is played at 1/100th of the speed, 100th up to 5% of the speed, but then I do layer because otherwise it would take 1 hour and 40 minutes.
I was trying to figure out where we are in the text.
Yeah, so I'm layering, I think 9 layers at one point to get down to 5 minutes. But also, if I speak 1 second longer, it could take 1 minute 40 seconds longer. Yes.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. I was just wondering the navigation strategy. I'm not sure if I understand how the say performance or whatever stops. Yeah, is it based on the sometimes all grades are red and that's it. That's all. You have implemented some kind of algorithm, search algorithm? Or?
Not yet. So for a moment, there's also a kind of macro composition that splits the text into a few bits and then layers them kind of always, and it just adapts to the total length. And then it applies this layering, stretching it to the length of the text. And of course, you're right, it would be nice to kind of recognize words and kind of synchronize words and synchronize fricative portions. That's for the next version.
I was curious about the rhythmic field. Is that also a product of the total length and the synchronization?
So it's really, so I'm not detecting dotted pulses, I'm detecting zero crossings. And I'm playing a grain at each zero crossing. I'm playing the grain that produces the zero crossing, but at 100th the speed. And so, a sinusoid would make a very regular pulse, but any harmonics will make a little double tap. And then, of course, the pitch, my speech prosody will create accelerandi and ritardandi. And this is really literal. Every sample of sound I recorded will be played, but 100th the speed. Or for the triggering. Of course, the grain itself will be the same sampling rate as the original.
So I noticed that, as you say, your processing is changing to have some effect. And you said that the contents of the vowels were non-periodic sounds, also people like that. Is the actual speech plan to have any sort of predictive, do something like that? Can be done.
But I mean, if you hear the trajectory, you can.
I'm saying, like, are you trying to plan content like I'm going to say these words that have these amount of vocals, vowels versus these amount of consonants?
Well, it is a bit constrained by the text, but you notice that I didn't read the text like I speak now, but I put in a lot of prosody and intonation to make it very nice, accelerandi and ritardandi. And I tried to finish with a ritardando, but the detection of the end is it's not perfect. So it didn't end with the structure, with some little bit of leftover noise, silence.
Yeah, I guess the question is that would you be able to plan content?
It would be possible to do speech following, and then really resynchronize parts and where I know there will be a certain polyrhythm happening, and then train the intervals with which I will speak two distant words, so they will somehow synchronize in a certain way. Yeah, it's possible.
There's obviously this connection to Alvin Lucier, and is it? Of course, it's kind of as a jumping off point. I'm curious to know if there's any sort of under the surface connections that you associate with Lucier or that work that is perhaps beyond the sort of obvious, like your articulation in the way Lucier articulates this text.
I mean, it's a homage, and it's not. This piece was created in 2019, when I'm sitting in a room. Was 50 years old. So the room was created in 69, year of my birth, also. And when I had the idea to do this, it was somehow inevitable. It came really over me. Couldn't resist to make as a homage to Alvin Lucier and to his fantastic concept of using speech and some long-term process. And so I made the connections in the text. Few citations, and it's a homage, definitely, to the process and to the mastery and the genie of Alvin Lucier. I think Jonathan wants to close the conference.
I thought it would be nice to finish with a very nice music. Well, I'll try to be quick, and I just want to thank you for coming. It's really, really nice. The presenters, all who presented the paper, and well, obviously the steering committee for letting us having this conference here, and the lab, Richard needed support. Jocelyn is here. Yes. Adrien is there. They all helped a lot. And the students, we didn't mention them, but they did a lot. The students of Aix-Marseille University. We mentioned the support. I'll say it again. Craig Lear, the ERC grant, who supported the concert yesterday. The Tenor network, a team, and yes, musicians, of course. We did made her work so hard. I stepped and I made a. Well, I thought I had a dream about her. So I thought you should know about it. You say hello to her. She's resting at the reception. You'll see her. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you all in Boston next year in May. Bye-bye. He's now in the CNU, Comité National de l'Université. Choosing who's going to teach it right. So there is or you can stay.
to be postponed for 3 days.